Hello and welcome to another edition of Google Hangouts hosted by the Romanian newspaper Adevarul. My name is Mircea, I'll be your host for today. We have a guest that has been traveling across the Middle East, and within the last few days we've seen that the area is still very much the focus of international media. His name is Matthew Van Dyke. He's an activist, a filmmaker, a student and a scholar within the Arab culture and history. Hello, Matthew, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Matthew, I watch your movies, and I've seen your work, and I've seen what you've done, both as an activist and as a filmmaker. And I have to say, I'm quite impressed, and I'm quite curious how all this started. Will you be so kind to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started being interested in the Arab culture and history?
Well, I went to Georgetown University and got my master's degree in security studies with a Middle East concentration. And at that time, I had wanted to work for the U.S. government. But once the war in Iraq started, I was opposed to the war in Iraq, and I joined the anti-war movement, and so I no longer wanted to work for government. After that, I set off for North Africa and the Middle East by motorcycle for 4 years, traveling from West Africa eventually to Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, and also Libya. And then in 2011, I'd recently returned from Afghanistan, and the revolution in Libya had started. And friends were telling me what was happening in the country, and friends that I had stayed in touch with, Libyan friends, from years before during my travels. And it looked like NATO was not going to get involved, and one of them said, why doesn't anybody help us? So I went to help my friends. I joined the revolution. I was wounded and captured. I spent nearly 6 months as a prisoner of war in Libya. One day I escaped prison with other prisoners and returned to combat on the front lines until the end of the war. And then after Libya, I went on to Syria and made a film called Not Anymore, Story of Revolution. I did to build public support for the revolution.
Now, I've seen the teaser and I've seen the movie about Syria. But throughout your experience and throughout your travels initially, did you expect to find or to... my question, I guess, is, did you have any expectations in terms of Arab civilization and culture compared to the Western culture, or did you set on this road trip with an open mind?
I had expectations, and I had an educational background, but I had no real experience in the region. So, I could do terrorism analysis, but I didn't know how to use a squat toilet when I got there.
I see.
So it was definitely a learning experience, and at times a very difficult one. But, the culture generally was very friendly and welcoming to me. I stayed in a lot of people's houses, made a lot of friends that later, now those contacts are very useful.
Oh, I'm sure of that. I would like to ask you, you've seen the Arab world going through one of its most important times in recent history, the Arab Spring. What do you think that settled the whole motion? Because you visited, obviously, before the Arab Spring and you spent time during the Arab Spring. What do you think were the triggers that were in place for that event to happen?
It was the intersection of long-standing grievances with technology. The emergence of Facebook and Twitter allowed people to organize in a way that previously they weren't able to. Political protests in the past required people to go and hand out flyers and pamphlets and to make phone calls and direct emails, things that were easily monitored and traced back to the people doing them, which made political organizing very risky. But with the increase in expansion of technology, it allowed people to rapidly mobilize people for mass protest movements. So it was a combination of technology finally catching up to people's demands and needs.
And probably the regimes either did not agree or did not understand what's going on around them, and could not. But do you think that if the regimes would have answered positively to these national aspirations, will they still be in place? Or some of the regimes needed to fall in order for the change to happen?
In a lot of cases, the regimes could have saved themselves, but the level of liberalization and expansion of liberty that would have been required was probably not palatable to them. But in all cases, they could have avoided the civil wars in Libya and Syria just by stepping down and by giving people what they wanted. But there was no way that these brutal authoritarian rulers would ever consider doing that, so they had to be kicked out.
Is that the case for Gaddafi as well? You've been there and you fought along the rebels. Do you think Gaddafi had any chance of saving himself?
If Gaddafi had stepped down at the beginning of the protests before slaughtering people in the streets, sure, he could have gone into exile, left the country, and still be alive somewhere enjoying a lot of the money he stole from Libya. But he chose to fight, and he fought to the end, and he paid a price for it.
True, and that's very true indeed. You're a journalist as well, and a filmmaker. And
well, I haven't been a journalist since 2009 or 2010, depending.
So you were a former. You don't consider yourself a journalist anymore?
No, and my journalism was very limited. I did some embedded reporting in Iraq, some embedded filming in Afghanistan. You know, I got the first page. I got my article on the first page of the newspaper when I was in Iraq, and the next day the newspaper went out of business, and I never got paid. So I've technically not been paid for an article. I've never sold photos or video to a news publication. I try to stay away from that at this time because of my activism. I don't like to mix the two things.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. Do you think that, and we see a lot of cases of journalism and journalists getting involved in activism, and the other way around, a lot of activists writing even for major publications. Do you think that's is that an objective thing to do, and is that fair, or is it something that should not be mixed together?
No, I think they should be kept entirely separate. I believe the journalists should remain objective as much as possible. I mean, they are human beings, and I know that the press, generally speaking, in conflicts in Libya and Syria, are opposed to the regime on a personal level. But I hope that they would remain objective. I think that a person can be both a journalist and an activist as long as they're the activist in an entirely separate matter than what they cover. Somebody shouldn't be a journalist writing about Syria and also be an activist for the revolution. I think that's entirely improper. There are Syrian journalists who do that, certainly, and especially Syrians who provide photographs and video to the major media companies, Reuters, Associated Press, those that are actually activists more than journalists. But
and in some cases,
they should be kept separate.
Yes, in some cases that actually ends up doing more harm than good, because it takes away some of the credibility from the video. And even if the videos or photos are genuine and they depict something horrible happening, sometimes they don't get published just because of this reason, because they come from the activist side of the conflict.
Right.
But,
and I'm working on a book about this very topic right now, and how it relates to especially reporting in Syria is being done. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that people don't know about that I'm hoping to put out there in a book that I'm working on. It'll be an ebook.
Is this a book that is, let's say, objective? I will be reading some of the reporting done on the activist side, because I know you've been traveling to Syria as well, and you got involved in that revolution on the activist side.
The book will be, it's between the lines, how Libya and Syria changed conflict reporting. It's written from my perspective as someone who's a former journalist, a former fighter, a current activist, and someone that has contacts on all sides of the revolution and in the rebel forces, in the local media activists, and with journalists. I have friends on all different levels and contacts and people that give me information from different sides that the other groups aren't aware of, and I've sort of put it together to try to give a very objective and sometimes scathing insight into what has actually been going on in the reporting of these two conflicts.
For the readers that are joining us as we talk, you can watch this on our website, www.adevarul.ro, or we can watch it live or recorded on our YouTube channel. We're talking with Matthew Van Dyke. He's a filmmaker, activist that fought in the Libyan war on the side of the rebels, and he got captured there. Ended up doing loads of projects, including some movies. Matthew, you traveled from Libya to Syria, and you got involved in 2 civil wars. Was there a difference between, or is there a difference between the Libyan conflict and the Syrian conflict?
At the heart of the conflicts, it's people wanting democracy and liberty. So in that respect, they're similar. But in the way that the conflicts are being pursued, they're quite different. The Libyan opposition was very organized. We had a lot of international support. Morale was very high. In Syria, it's quite the opposite. There's very little international support. There's not only disorganization, a lack of unity among units, but units actually compete with each other. They occasionally fight each other. There's a lot of different factions involved. It's a very difficult situation. And without the international support especially, ammunition costs are very high. A bullet for an AK-47 might be $1 to $2 a piece. It's very hard to fight a war like that. In Libya, we had unlimited free ammunition. So even the practical aspects like that are so different that it's not very surprising the way that the wars have progressed in comparison to each other.
And yes, and you mentioned these factions fighting amongst each other. As someone that joined the ranks of the rebels, were you afraid that you're going to join the wrong side? And I'm not talking about the 2 obvious sides, the rebels and the regime. Obviously, you made your choice. I'm talking about these different factions. How can you tell which one's good and intended for good purposes and which one is trying to steal the revolution, so to say?
Well, when I was in Libya, the first group I joined was along with a friend, a Libyan friend that I'd known for years, so that wasn't too much of an issue. And when I escaped prison, I went back to the front line and joined the National Liberation Army. We were an organized military force, so we took the unit I joined was part of the rebel army. I was issued a rebel military ID. We took our directives from the political body in Libya, so there wasn't too much of a concern. In Syria, I was asked to join units by their commanders when I was there. I chose not to, partly because I don't know the commanders there. They didn't. Some of them that asked me didn't particularly impress me, and I decided I didn't want to join any particular group in Syria. And so far, I've stuck to advisory and other roles rather than actually hands-on fighting. At this time in Syria, they don't need another man on the front line. They need international support, which is the whole reason I decided to make a film instead of fighting at that time. And I'm working on other projects. Some I've talked about, some I can't talk about, for the opposition that I think will be more effective than me taking a gun to the front line in this particular conflict at this particular time.
I understand. And speaking of that, you said you made a film. We're talking about the Not Anymore, the story of a revolution. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And for our readers, I will make sure I'll post a teaser. There's one posted to this Hangout, and I'll post a teaser in the article as well to this documentary. How did the whole documentary idea started?
Well, after Libya, I was initially going to go and fight in Syria, but the rebels lacked weapons and ammunition and international support in a lot of other ways. So I decided that to maximize the effectiveness of what I could do, I would try to make a film that would help build international support and hopefully get them what they needed to fight the war. So I spent my own money. It cost me about $30,000 to make the film. I traveled to Syria and stayed about a month. I met Noor Kelsey, who stars in the film. She also became a producer on the film. It was very dangerous filming. We had to run across streets to avoid snipers. We were constantly at risk of mortar strikes, air strikes, threat of kidnapping.
What city did you film in?
What?
In what city did you film?
In Aleppo.
In Aleppo.
And while I was there filming, the Assad regime broadcast on Syrian state TV channels that I was a terrorist and showed video and photos of me fighting in Libya. So people in Aleppo would recognize me as the terrorist from television. So that made filming quite a bit more dangerous. But, you know, we stayed, we kept filming, released the film. It's been shown on TV in some countries. It's won 53 awards as of today. And I have a screening at the State Department later this week, and I've sent a DVD to every member of Congress. So it's really an effort to try to change people's hearts and minds about the conflict. But I wish it had been more effective in doing that, and I'm still trying.
Well, I'm sure the video definitely helps. And you said you have a projection at the State Department and in the Congress. This does mean that you change your mind in terms of working not for but with the U.S. government on solving this crisis, or was this a general attitude of cooperation at all times with the U.S. authorities on these crises?
I have no problem cooperating with U.S. authorities. It's not the reason I didn't want to work for government at the time after getting my degree. Well, that was about 10 years ago. Now, was my opposition to the Iraq War was that I didn't feel that it was good for my country, and that with my degree, that's what I would have been assigned to work on. And if I didn't fully believe in it, I didn't think it was right for me to be working on it. But a lot of the times, U.S. policy and what I believe in happen to line up. And at those times, sure, it's the most powerful country in the world. If I can help convince some people at the State Department to put more pressure on Obama, or if I can convince some congressmen to vote a certain way on certain bills, then I'll absolutely do that. Sure, I mean, the U.S. government and I have no problems with each other, but yeah, I certainly do not work for them, and they definitely don't work for me. If they did, they'd be doing a lot of things differently.
I'm sure they would. Did you ever had any problems going back and traveling to the U.S. after these conflicts? Because I myself, as a journalist, I've been to Syria, and on my way back from Syria, I actually was asked by one of the FSA rebels to have a stamp on my passport, and obviously it was optional. And I said, sure, why not? It'll be a nice souvenir on my passport. And I still have that symbol, that rebel stamp exit visa from one of the border crossings close to Kilis and in Turkey. And I had some people questioning that, especially authorities. Did you ever have any problems traveling across the world with your reputation and knowing that on any Google search you might pop up?
I do have problems. It's a bit of a delay when I re-enter the United States. And just in the past few months, actually. Coming back from Syria, I had no problems. But for some reason, just in the past few months, I was actually coming back from vacation. And I had 5 hours of questioning. Things that they could have just Googled me. I told them just go use Google. They're asking me the same questions that everybody already knows the answers to. It just depends. It's really just airport security guys don't know very much. A lot of them can't find the countries on the map that they're asking me about, to be quite honest about it. So it's more an inconvenience than anything. But yeah, it's a frustrating inconvenience. Once your name's in the system, it's very hard to get your name out of that computer.
Of course. Do you plan on going back to Syria?
Yes. Yes. I would have been back in Syria already, but there was a project I was working on to try to open a media center that would be run by Syrian women journalists, and all of the work at that stage of the project required me to be working in the U.S., trying to get funding and other things. So I don't really enter Syria now unless there's a reason, because anybody that works with me, since I'm wanted by the Assad regime for terrorism, anybody that would work with me is at more risk. I'm kind of a target for kidnapping, so I would need a certain number of people with me just as security detail. It's very hard for me to travel low-key like I used to. When I made the film in Syria, I was driving a motorcycle. I bought a motorcycle in Aleppo. I would drive my own motorcycle, do the filming, make the film, but I can't really operate like that anymore because of all the publicity after the film. So me going to Syria, I have to have a good reason, not just for myself, but for the people who will be working with me.
And speaking of Syria, we've seen in the recent days some of these terrorism organizations that got involved in the civil war in Syria moving towards Iraq. Obviously, it's not a good thing for Iraq, but from another perspective, do you think that will ease up the pressure on the civil war in Syria and actually help, on the long run, the rebels finally win over the Assad regime?
I don't know. It's very difficult to tell because on the one hand, you could view it as it puts more impetus on U.S. foreign policy to support moderate rebels in Syria so that they can fight ISIS more effectively and so that they don't get overrun by ISIS. It also, from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, You know, there exists now a safe haven for ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, and the Assad regime is clearly not capable of preventing that safe haven, which puts them in a similar category as to what the Taliban in Afghanistan were in 2001, which could completely be used for justification to militarily attack the Assad regime, and I would love to see that happen. But on the other hand, it also creates a gut reaction in Americans that they don't want to become involved in the region, that it's too complicated for them to wrap their heads around, and that they have spent enough on Iraq and Afghanistan. And also, there's the risk that ISIS has now taken some of the Humvees and other equipment that they captured in Iraq and taken them back to Syria already and are parading them in the streets. And that presents a significant military threat to the Free Syrian Army and other moderate rebels who have been fighting ISIS, now that ISIS may be returning with heavy weaponry and much more ammunition that they've captured from Iraq.
Have you ever met any of these people from the ISIS organization while you're in Syria or in Libya or in any parts throughout the Middle East? Have you ever personally met any of these people organized?
When I was working on the film in Aleppo, I stayed in a building that happened to be guarded. The front entrance was guarded by Free Syrian Army, and the back entrance was guarded by Jabhat al-Nusra. It was very strange cooperation on this one building.
Well, I know that at one point they had cooperation, and it was up until the point that these extreme fundamentalists started taking over the revolution goals. So initially, I think they were welcomed in Syria by the rebels.
Right. Yes, early on, and this was in October, November 2012. Things started to go downhill between them after that. So at that point, you know, I had not really spoken with Jabhat al-Nusra members, but I had interaction with them. I was staying in the same building for weeks, basically living in the same building with them. And I was later told that some of the people that were there at that building later joined ISIS, months later. I was recently told that by one of the FSA who was in the building at that same time. But I generally kept my distance from Jabhat al-Nusra. You know, they were obviously suspicious of me. And I didn't have any reason to have any association with them. But, you know, everybody was living in the same building. But that was about the extent of the contact.
I see. Now, with your documentary, you probably traveled to many places and then to many showings. Is there a different perception in terms of the reaction you get about what's happening in Syria throughout your work as a filmmaker, and the reactions you get, let's say, in Europe? Are Europeans more interested or less interested in what's happening in Syria than Americans?
I'd say the interest level. The interest level is similar, you know, as far as the ones that I actually get to go to where I have interactions with the audience. The level of being informed about the conflict may be a bit higher in Europe than in the United States, partly because of Europe's proximity to the conflict and Europe's greater concern about jihadists returning from Syria and causing problems in Europe. You know, there's a lot of interconnectedness between the two, much more than there is between Syria and the United States. But no, generally, the people are concerned about it, and the film is a highly emotional film. So, you know, generally, audiences are emotionally moved by it, which is what I'm going for with the film.
I understand, and I'll try to make this film more popular. I'm on our website. Maybe we'll try to have a screening here and one of our festivals and have you as a guest. But meantime, we actually have some Syrian refugees, believe it or not, are actually in Romania. Romania and Bulgaria are one of the first countries they come to if they try to come towards Europe. And the government here hasn't been that efficient in handling the Syrian refugee crisis. What do you think, as someone that's been on the ground, that governments dealing with refugees should do?
What they should do is support the Syrian opposition to overthrow the Assad regime so everybody can go home. You know, the situation of having hundreds of thousands or millions of people as permanent refugees is completely unacceptable. If the Assad regime regains control of Syria, a lot of these people can never go home because a lot of them have family members or connections to the opposition. They'll never be safe, And even if they do return home, most likely nearly all of their houses have been looted completely or destroyed. So unless Europe and the region in the Middle East wants to absorb a massive Syrian refugee population, they need to act quick and topple the Assad regime as quickly as possible.
And I'm sure that will be harder and harder to do, especially that the Assad regime actually had elections, and Assad obviously won again. What's your feeling towards those elections? Is there something that can be done democratically at this point, or in a way that the opposition can move into power in Damascus, or the revolution is the only way?
Well, if your president wins an election by 85% or more, you might be living under authoritarianism. You know, the elections were a joke. The opposition areas weren't given access to vote. People were given food in some areas in exchange for voting. I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. What needs to be done are military strikes on Assad regime, air support, a no-fly zone, and not just because of the military effect it would have, but because of the morale boost it would give to the moderate opposition and the defections it would cause from Assad forces. You see defections increase dramatically when people feel that the regime is going to fall and they feel that the international community has taken a stand that the regime will not last. And this is why early on in the revolution, a lot of people defected from Assad's forces, believing that NATO would do an air campaign similar to what had been done in Libya. And you would see massive defections again once missiles started dropping on Syria. So that's really the only hope, I think, for the fall of Assad. Supplying weapons to the revolution will hopefully keep it alive until the U.S. gets a president that's willing to do what needs to be done to end the conflict militarily. But you know, Syria is looking at years more of war, possibly breaking up into 2 or 3 parts, or at the very least being a failed state where Assad maintains control of certain areas and the rest is left to ISIS, the opposition, smugglers, bandits, and anybody else that chooses to pass through.
Matthew, thank you very much for explaining all this and reminding our readers how important it is to solve this crisis. And I want to really thank you for your patience, because, as I'm sure you probably answered these questions over and over by so many media organizations that want to talk to you. And I see that you're still very much engaged and patient in answering. So on a personal level, I really want to thank you for taking the time to spend it today with our readers and with me explaining what's going on in Syria and your work as a fundraiser, as an activist, as a filmmaker. You can watch Matthew's teaser for the movie Syria, for the documentary Syria Not Anymore, Story of a Revolution, on our website, and I'll put a link to Matthew's website where you can find many more resources, including getting in touch with him via social networks and sending him your messages and support for his work. I'll put subtitles, as you know, to this interview shortly, and a text will follow. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Anytime.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.